of some repetitiveness, but that's okay, because repetition helps with command and mastery of material. All right. So let's dive into the continuation of our first tissue type, epithelial tissue. Remember, there's 4 tissue types in the body: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and then nervous tissue. And so epithelial tissue, we talked about simple versus stratified. So we're going to continue on here and talk about our stratified epithelium. And so you know that stratified epithelium is going to be epithelium that has 2 or more cell layers. So the first name tells you how many cell layers are going to be involved. And so stratified epithelium is always going to have 2 or more layers. And the top layer of cells, this again should sound like review to you, it's the appearance of those cells that we name the epithelium after, right? Because remember, when you have multiple layers, the bottom layer can look completely different from the top layer, as we've seen, all right, in some of the examples. And so we're always going to name this epithelium, all right, for the appearance of the apical cell layer. That's the topmost cell layer. So especially in the skin, when we get into that chapter next, right, you'll see the bottom layer, which we call the basal layers. Those, for example, in stratified squamous epithelium can almost appear to be cuboidal in shape, or what we call low columnar. So kind of an intermediary. But as those cell layers progress towards the surface, they start to become flatter and flatter and flatter. And then when we look at the apical cell layer, we'll notice that they have that flattened squamous shape there. So stratified epithelium is going to be found in areas that undergo a lot of abrasive forces, high mechanical stress areas. So its function is protection, right? And it protects against abrasive forces like friction. So like the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, those are going to be made up of stratified squamous epithelium because they're constantly going to be undergoing mechanical stress there, from walking or when you're using your hands to whatever your job function is. Being a student, there's still a lot of activity involved, but still you're going to see that epithelium in places where mechanical stress is elevated there. So the bottom cell layer, that basal layer there, those cells, their job is to continuously just undergo mitosis, just divide constantly. And so as they do, the newer cells get pushed, or excuse me, the older cells get pushed towards the surface there. And so they'll eventually migrate to the surface and be sloughed off, for example, like in our skin. Right? Same thing when we're talking about our epithelium in our cheeks, in our mouth, right? The cells that are close to that oral cavity there towards the surface, what we call superficial cells, those are the older cells. And so as you're chewing food, for example, right, those cells will slough off. And as you're chewing the food, you'll swallow it and then digest them. Right? So that's what we're going to see. Older cells are going to be pushed towards the surface there. So stratified squamous epithelium comes in 2 types. We have keratinized and non-keratinized. Right? If you recall, keratin is a protein that makes the cells stronger, all right, and hardier, tougher, all right, yay, but unfortunately it kills the cell. So once keratin gets produced, it starts to destroy the organelles and then eventually the nucleus. And once all that stuff, the inside of the cell, I don't want to say it's necessarily gutted, but it's filled up with keratin. Great that the keratin makes the cell stronger, but in doing so, it kills the cell. So the cell has a limited lifespan after that. All right, so we're going to see this type of epithelium in the outermost layer of your skin, the epidermis. So as you're looking at yourself or each other, right, or anybody, what you're looking at is the epidermal layer, and that outer epidermal layer is going to have keratinized epithelium in it. And so you're essentially looking at dead cells. Right, dead cells there. And keep this in mind when we're looking at those cells, the newer cells will be found at the bottom and the older cells will be closer to the apical surface there. Thoughts, questions, concerns? This should be kind of a review for you. All right, the other type of stratified squamous epithelium is the non-keratinized. So that means these cells are not dead. All right, so they should all be alive. Same type of scenario though, all right, the older cells will be pushed towards the apical surface and they'll migrate upwards. And so since we don't have keratin here, our cells will be alive. So these cells are going to be found in moist areas. So I tell folks exits and entrances to the body. And if you look here, where you're going to see this type of epithelium, oral cavity. Parts of the pharynx, which are the throat, right? Your esophagus, we all know that's the tube that connects your pharynx, your throat, down to the stomach. And then you have the anus and the vagina. Again, entrances and exits to the body, right? And these areas will be in most situations in a moist environment, mainly because of the secretions that are being produced. So for example, in our mouths, right, we're going to have saliva that's being produced. And so that'll be a relatively moist environment there. So again, if you look here, and I like this slide a little bit better than the previous slide, if we zoom in, remember one of the things I told you when we were labeling in lab class, when you look at the cells, look for the nuclei. And if you can see any nuclei, and you can see it here in this sample, there's a couple nuclei in the apical layer right up there. Even if you find one, you can assume that it's living. Right? If it's keratinized, and it won't be very good on the previous slide, I don't really like that slide sample, but if it's keratinized, you wouldn't see any nuclei in these cells, all right, in several of these layers here. It wouldn't be like just one random one. You wouldn't see any because all of those nuclei have died. And so those cells are dead. Okay, so moving on through our stratified moving on through our stratified epithelium, we'll move on to the next cell type, and that's the cuboidal cell type. So our stratified cuboidal epithelium, same type of scenario, and we're talking about the shape of the cells. Squamous or flattened. Okay, flattened cells, cuboidal are going to be, well, like a cube. So they're going to be as high as they are wide. Right? And the nucleus, dead center, nice spherical shaped nucleus there. So we're going to see this type of epithelium in tubes and some of the coverings here of certain structures. So its functions are going to be protection and secretion, because a lot of times when we're dealing with their location, if they're in some tubes there's going to be some sort of related secretion function associated with that there. So when we talk about secretion, you should be thinking glands, because glands like to secrete stuff. And so most of our exocrine glands, and remember the definition of exocrine versus endocrine, exocrine glands are glands that have ducts, D-U-C-T-S. So you have a part of the gland that makes the secretion, and then another part of the gland that's going to transmit that secretion somewhere. And that transmission area of those glands, that's called the duct. And so that's where you're going to see this type of epithelium. So what are some of our more famous glands? Well, sweat glands. Right? That's where you're going to see this epithelium, and you'll also see it around in parts of the male urethra. There's 3 parts to that. And then also we'll see it in the ovarian follicles. And some folks don't even know what the ovarian follicles are. And that's, I tell folks, that's the studio apartment that an oocyte, an egg, lives in. And so when you get into chapter 28, that's in 211, when you're learning about the reproductive system, you'll talk more about the ovarian follicles. Remember how we learned that our osteocytes and our chondrocytes in our connective tissue there for cartilage and bone live in lacuna, right? Those spaces. Well, an ovarian follicle is similar to that. It's a, I won't say it's a space, but it's a structure, and the best way I can describe it, it's usually a one-chamber structure that looks like a studio apartment, and then the oocyte lives in there. But more on that in another class. All right, then we have another rare type of columnar epithelium, and this is our stratified columnar epithelium. And so again, we're dealing with a different cell, right, shape here. This is columnar, so the cell will look as tall. It'll be taller than it is wide. And then the actual nucleus sits at the bottom, what we call the basilar portion of the cell. Just a little bit of review, and it looks like an egg. And so this type of epithelium, again, we're going to see it's closely related, to protection and secretion. So again, when you hear that term secretion, you should think, all right, we're going to be dealing with some sort of gland. And the popular glands are going to be our salivary glands there. Right, so again, we will find stratified columnar epithelium that's going to line the ducts of those salivary glands. And then, of course, when in doubt, right, just default to parts of the male urethra. All right, the male urethra has several different types of tissue lining it, depending on where we are in the male urethra there. Okay, so that's it for stratified columnar epithelium. The last type of epithelium that we're going to discuss here is our transitional. This is the transformer epithelium, right? Its appearance is going to depend on what is happening to that epithelium, if it's stretched or if it's relaxed. So there's two states that this epithelium can be in. So this epithelium is going to be found primarily in the urinary system, primarily found in the urinary bladder. And this is the one I was telling you about. When the bladder is full, right, the urine compresses this epithelium, pushes it down, and flattens it out. So in the stretched state, it'll appear flattened and thin, and it looks like squamous epithelium. When the bladder is empty, again, there's no urine pressing down at the epithelium, so the epithelium takes on this kind of polyhedral or kind of like that cuboidal appearance. Like I said, it'll look, and again, you have to forgive my drawing abilities, it'll look something like that. It'll be rounded at the top there, right? And that's in the relaxed state. But one of the characteristics that you'll notice in these cells is they'll have two nuclei, which means it's binucleated. This is the one I was telling you, it has the owl's eyes appearance to it. So again, you can kind of see here for our transitional epithelium, you can see here in the nice relaxed state, there's no urine in the bladder, right? So the apical cells aren't being compressed, so they'll have that rounded appearance there at the top, and they won't appear squamous. They won't look flattened. They'll be more rounded at the top. And then you can see here's our nuclei. We have our binucleated cells. Here's another one over here. All right, there's several all over the place. Then in our stretched state, when the bladder is full, you'll see the apical cells here are now more compressed because the urine is pressing down on them. And so again, very difficult to see in this particular slide, but we still have binucleated cells in that epithelium there. All right, good slide to pay attention to here. Simple epithelium. You want to think of absorption, secretion, and diffusion. And then our stratified protection. Okay, protection. Just a rule of thumb. Oh, everybody's favorite topic, glands. I won't go into the actual anatomy of the glands, but we're now going to talk more about the physiology and some of these various appearances and these various types of glands here, right? So a gland is going to be a structure that is going to make something and then secrete it out. So essentially, a gland can be one single individual cell, what we call a unicellular gland, or we can have many, many cells. And so glands are going to make these secretions, and it could be a variety of things. It can be something like enzymes, like in our saliva. It can be like the goblet cells that produce the mucin that when it mixes with water makes mucus. And then we'll have glands like our sweat glands, for example, the Exocrine sweat glands, which produce mainly water, but also as you going through that perspiration process, in our sweat, you'll find electrolytes, right? Like potassium, sodium, and calcium in diluted levels. And then we'll also see hormones. Although we won't talk about the hormones too much in this course, you're going to get more into that when you get into another course in 211. You'll talk about the endocrine glands, but those are still secretions that glands will produce. So just a quick review, we have two types. We have endocrine glands, and those are and exocrine glands. Endocrine lack ducts. So therefore, when they're secreting something, they are going to release those secretions either directly into your bloodstream or into what we call the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that resides outside of your cells. Okay, so outside of your cells, you have interstitial fluid, and then you have blood vessels. And so interstitial fluid and blood vessels, right, are going to have very similar composition of the type of fluid that's in those spaces, right, when you compare it to blood plasma, except you'll see a lot more proteins, and you'll learn this concept in another class. You're going to see a lot more protein in your blood than what you would find in the interstitial fluid. But the point being is endocrine glands are going to release their secretions, their hormones into the interstitial fluid, which will eventually make its way into a blood vessel or directly into blood vessels. And they have to do that because they don't have these cool things. They lack the ducts there. All right, but what we're going to be talking about more in this semester is going to be the exocrine glands. So they do have a duct. And basically, all right, these glands came from epithelium that used to be superficial, that used to live on the outside of your body before you really even had a humanoid body. And what happened was that epithelial tissue pushed its way in during development. It pushed its way into the deeper parts of your skin, for example, and your tissues there. So at one point, they sat on the outside, but then the specialized epithelium just pushed its way down. That's what we talk about, that it is invaginated. Okay, it pushed down, all right, through the layers of epithelium down into the connective tissue in the second layer of your skin, like the dermis, which we'll learn about in lab today. All right, so you'll know much better what I'm talking about here. But anyways, so you have the surface of your skin up here, and then you have your gland way down here. So we've got to figure out a way to get those secretions up to the surface of your skin, for example, if we're talking about sweat glands, all right, in your skin, those exocrine glands. So we have this structure here called a duct. And that's what we're going to talk about along with some other things. All right, so that's the duct. That is going to travel through some of the connective tissue and epithelial tissue to the surface of the epithelium. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about sweat glands, right? But you'll see these glands in other areas, mammary glands, salivary glands, right? And so these glands produce secretions that are eventually going to have to travel through this structure right here, this duct-like structure. So let's start off talking about the very first type, and those are these unicellular exocrine glands. This is our goblet cell. Right. Now, granted, the goblet cell doesn't contain, it says up there, does not contain a duct. That is true to a point, right? But I didn't classify all this, but usually what I tell folks is there's always exceptions to the rule. But if you consider the opening of the apocrine gland, if you consider the opening of the goblet cell, right, there is some width to that, and that could be considered a duct. But to be honest with you, all right, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule here. And so you don't really technically have a duct because it is so close to the surface of that epithelium. But now let's get into the multicellular exocrine glands, right? So obviously, when you see that word multicellular, you're going to think that there's multiple cells involved, and that's what you'll see here. So there's two parts to the cell. You're going to have the part that makes the secretions, and it looks kind of like a balloon. It's kind of expanded. And then it kind of tapers down to a skinnier area, and it leads to this long tube-like structure. Or it doesn't have to be long, but it's going to lead to a tube-like structure. And so the expanded area is called the acini. And so that's going to be the secretory portion. And then you have that tube-like structure, that's the duct. And that's going to be what we call the conducting portion. That's going to conduct the secretions from the secretory portion out to the surface of that epithelium here, if we're talking about like a sweat gland or whatnot. Okay, so here's what I'm getting at. This part right here, there's the acini, that's the secretory portion, and then you have the conducting portion, which is the duct here. And what this is showing you here, this exocrine gland, what we're doing is we're just taking a whole bunch of these structures here, these secretory portions of cells and conducting portions of cells there, all right, and then we're creating, right, our overall exocrine gland. But you'll notice on the surface here of the exocrine gland, you have a capsule that goes around it, and that capsule is usually made up of dense irregular connective tissue. And like I was telling you before, right, how we talked about that process of invagination, how something on the surface will push interior to whatever structure, that's what we see here. So you'll have parts of this this dense irregular connective tissue that pushes inwards to the center of this gland here, and it creates these little partitions here. And so these partitions create these structures, what we call a lobe, right? So the lobe isn't the whole gland, right? But it's a significant part of the gland in which these sections of the capsule have just separated parts of the gland from one another. So when we talk about our exocrine glands and how we classify them, we are going to classify them through the method of secretion. So I'm basically going to talk to you about these three different types of exocrine glands, and how we classify them, let me repeat myself, is based on how they secrete the stuff that they're making. So we'll start off with the first one called the merocrine glands. So what these glands will do is that you will have the organelles inside the glands are going to make their secretions, and they're going to put them into vesicles. And we're familiar with vesicles because in chapter 4, we learned about the secretory vesicles that the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus make. So something similar to that, right? So these cells start to make their secretions, and they put them in these little bubbles, these vesicles. And then they're going to then transport those vesicles to the apical surface of that cell. And then that vesicle will fuse with the plasma membrane. Does anyone know what that process is called? When it fuses with the plasma membrane and then it releases its contents to outside the cell? You nailed it. Yes, exocytosis. If you don't know what that is, watch the video that I sent you because it's the remaining material in chapter 4. I talk about that. It's an active transport process. Very important because if you want to understand the material in chapter 12, when we get to the nervous system, you need to understand what exocytosis is. So it's that process where the cell makes something, it packages it up, and then it's going to release it outside the cell. And that vesicle, literally, it will fuse with the plasma membrane and it releases the contents outside of the cell. And so that does require energy because it's an active process. So be familiar with exocytosis. So you can see all these various area or glands that will see this type of secretion, right? Your tear duct, I was going to say tear ducts, but your lacrimal glands, the ones that actually create tears, salivary glands, right? A lot of different sweat glands, and we say some, right? But right, there's two different types of sweat glands that we'll be talking about here momentarily. Right, the exocrine glands of the pancreas, when we're talking about making our digestive enzymes. And then when you get into chapter 26, you'll talk a lot about the gastric glands in the stomach there. So I'm going to show you a picture. I swear to you, I'll come right back to that slide. So this picture here, this is an example of the merocrine glands right here. So there's the secretory portion. Here's the conducting portion. There's the duct. And if you, I wish I could zoom it in even more, but this is showing you how the cells are making these vesicles here. And then those vesicles will fuse with the apical surface of the plasma membrane, and they'll release the secretions out into this lumen area here, this opening, and then those secretions will then migrate through the conducting portion, the duct here, out to the surface, right, of the epithelium there. So that's a merocrine gland, okay? Let's talk about the apicrine gland. Some of you have no idea what the heck a lava lamp is. Some of you might, right? But a lava lamp is going to be this light structure that has some goo in the middle of it. If you ever watched, right, when the lava lamp is doing its thing, right, these almost like these bubble-like parts of the material inside kind of separate from one another. And that's what we're seeing here when we're talking about our apicrine glands here. Literally, right, the apical plasma membrane will pinch off. So part of the cell kind of, I won't say self-destructs, that's a different type of gland, but part of the cell, all right, just kind of crumbles off. And that, in addition to whatever the cell made, because we saw with the merocrine glands that the merocrine glands made some secretion and then packaged it up. You're going to see that same thing happening here, right? But instead of doing it similar to the merocrine gland, the apicrine gland is like, well, I'm just going to blow off the top part of my cell, right? And that's what happens. The apical surface, and I'll show you a picture, gets blown off, we're still going to release our secretions through exocytosis. So in addition to getting whatever that cell made through the secretions, now you're going to get a little bit extra from the plasma membrane that pinched off. What's in the plasma membrane? What's in our plasma membranes of our cells? What makes up the plasma membrane? Phospholipids. Okay, so that's the fatty part, and then proteins. Exactly. So these secretions are going to have more fat in them, more lipid content because of the phospholipids. And then because there's also proteins in your plasma membrane, you'll see a little bit of a higher protein content. That's what we're going to see here, right? And so after it kind of blows its top, and the cell fixes itself. So we're going to see this type of secretion in our mammary glands, and then in these sweat glands that are located, right, in your armpits and in your groin, right? Those are called apocrine cells there. And so basically in the axillary areas and in the pubic areas. So this is what this type of cell looks like. Right here. So there's your apocrine gland right there. So again, you can see here, similar situation. We have our secretory cells here. And so they're going to be making whatever secretions, right? But at the same time, right, it's not going to utilize the release of the secretion solely through exocytosis, right? It's going to use exocytosis, but in addition to that, the apical surface of the cell just pinches off. So you'll have a larger amount of secretion going in, right? But the same type of scenario here, right? All of those secretions are going to go into the lumen of the secretory portion and then make their way out through the duct here. Right, so that's going to be our apocrine glands. So now you can kind of see, right, in women that breastfeed or they talk about nursing, how, right, breast milk has a higher protein and fat concentration. Well, yeah, because part of the cells that make the milk, right, that mom is secreting is going to have the apical surface or plasma membrane that got blown off, right, during that process there. So you'll even get more proteins and more lipids. All right, then our last type of cell is going to be our holocrine glands. So these types of glands, right, they're going to take it one step further than our apocrine glands. Apocrine glands are like, I'm just going to blow my top, right? And then holocrine glands are like, hold my beer. I'm going to blow myself up. And so that's what the cells do in these glands. They literally will blow themselves up. All right, I say that, but we call it cell disintegration. And so they'll just kind of fall apart. But again, now you're going to get even more of the composition of the cell in the secretions. So these types of glands, their secretions are going to be a little bit thicker, or what we call more viscous, because of all the stuff that's in there. Yes, we have the cell fragments because the cells decide to blow themselves up, but also those cells were making something, and so we'll have the cell product, and then we'll have the cell fragments, thus giving us a thicker secretion there. And so you'll see these types of cells, all right, throughout your skin, all right, are sebaceous glands. The things that give your skin that oily composition, all right, these are those types of glands, the sebaceous glands. And so that secretion that these glands make, we call it sebum. Most people will just wipe a paper towel on their face and look at the paper towel and they'll be like, oh, that's just oil and grease. It's called sebum, right? And the reason why is because it's going to have a little bit of a thicker type of secretion because of everything that's in that secretion. The cell product, whatever the cell was making, and then also, right, because the cell decided to blow itself up, then it's going to have cell fragments there that are going to be involved in the secretions there. So let me show you a picture. Here you go. You look all the way to the right of the screen there. There is your holocrine gland. So here are all these cells that are busy making their secretions and dividing, and then they get to this area here, this apical part, and then they just blow up. And the remnants and the fragments of the cells, along with whatever they were making, right? That gets pushed out through the duct, and then it goes on to the epithelial surface there. And so that's the holocrine gland. And how I remember what a holocrine gland does, if you've ever heard of a holocaust, a lot of destruction goes on in a holocaust, all right? Whether it's a nuclear holocaust or whatever, right? You'll have destruction of things, and that's how I remember holocrine gland, because it destroys itself, essentially. Thoughts, questions, concerns on anything? Not too bad. All right. So if you kind of have a general idea, and we're going to talk about some of these as we get more so in the skin chapter. And so this is what this slide is, just a rehash of what I was talking about for the glands. When we talk about our exocrine glands, we classify them by the method of the way they make their secretions, how they secrete their material there. Right, so the merocrine glands, they package stuff up, release it through exocytosis. Apocrine glands, they are going to release things through exocytosis, but at the same time, that's the cell that blows its top. It's going to cause the apical surface of the plasma membrane to blow off. And then our holocrine glands are like, we're going to make stuff, but then we're just going to blow ourselves up, and all of that is going to be our secretion, and that's what we see here. This will have a thicker type of mixture in that secretion because it's having cell fragments and whatever was being secreted there. Okay. Let's get into our connective tissue portion here. Again, we've already talked about this in lab, so this will be serve as a nice review here, but with a few details that I didn't really go into in lab. All right, so you did hear me mention when we talked about connective tissue that this is the most diverse and most abundant type of tissue in your body. It's more abundant than skeletal, it's more abundant than muscle, more abundant than nervous tissue, right? Connective tissue is the most abundant here. So if you don't know this, or you haven't taken the time to learn it yet or memorize it, write this down. Here are the functions: support, protect, and bind organs. All right, support, protect, and bind organs. So if you look at pretty much all of these examples here, tendons, ligaments, adipose tissue, connective, cartilage, bone, and blood, right? Those all are going to fill these functions there. Maybe not all of them, but they will do, at least one of those. All right. Tendons and ligaments. What do? Well, one, they support your skeletal, your skeleton. Ligaments hold bones together, and then tendons hold muscle to bone, right? So that takes support there. Even you could say binding organ, because bones are organs. Right? And so I could go on and on. Adipose tissue, that protects tissues, right? Because it's around an organ, it offers it cushioning, also provides insulation. So we can go through all of these, and we've talked about their functions. All right, blood, you're probably thinking, well, how does that support anything? All right, that is going to fill more of the protection role, because what's in your blood? Your leukocytes, your white blood cells, and those are immune cells, and so they help to protect the body from pathogens, from infection. All right, so keep that in mind when we talk about the function of connective tissue: support, protect, and bind. So all of our connective tissue comes from the origin tissue, which we call mesenchyme. And mesenchyme is what we call embryonic stem cell tissue. So it's pluripotent. It can become a bunch of different things there, all right? But again, it depends on what genetic coding that cell has is going to determine what it's going to transform into, all right? So mesenchyme is the starting point for all of our connective tissue. And then that connective tissue has three choices on what it can become. It can become connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, or fluid connective tissue. Right, so that's what we're going to see here. We're all going to start off with this embryonic connective tissue called mesenchyme, and then that mesenchyme is then going to differentiate or specialize itself into either connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, or fluid connective tissue. So connective tissue can come in a lot of different varieties. Remember, I said it's the most abundant and it's the most diverse. So it can have that fluid composition there, right? Or it could be something that's almost solid, like bone, and you can get parts in between. And so when we talk about the different characteristics, one of the characteristics we should talk about is vascularity. What that means is there a lot of blood vessels in that tissue, or is there not a lot of blood vessels in that tissue? And it ranges. All right, for example, mature cartilage, mind you, is avascular. So hyaline cartilage, that cartilage, remember we talked about the hyaline cartilage makes up the fetal skeleton. It makes up the tip of your nose, your rib cartilage, the costal cartilage, but it also makes up what we call articular cartilage. And that's the cartilage that covers the ends of your long bones. So like in your fingers, your knees, your elbows, it's going to cover where the two bones or more will come together and articulate with one another. Well, cartilage it's durable and sturdy, right? But it also helps to reduce friction. Problem is, it does not have a blood supply, right? So that's in itself not a good thing. So you're going to see in our connective tissue that depending on what we're looking at, for example, our areolar connective tissue, which is a loose type of connective tissue, there's a lot of space inside that tissue. So blood vessels will be in there quite a bit. So it's going to be highly vascularized. Adipose tissue the same way, right? It's going to be highly vascularized, a lot of blood vessels that are going to that tissue. So we'll see a difference. You can have something that has a lot of blood vessels, something that doesn't have a lot, like your tendons and ligaments, and then some that have nothing, like mature cartilage. So, and we'll go through that. I'll mention that. Okay. So quickly looking at the functions of our connective tissue. I already said this before, right? You're going to have support, right? Binding and protection. And so you're going to see physical protection, literally, bones, okay? Your skeleton, your skull gives you physical protection, gives your brain physical protection, right? And so we'll see when we're talking about support and structural framework, right? Ligaments will help with that, holding your skeletal bones together. Binding of structures, you're going to see tons, right? When we're getting into tendons and ligaments and some of our other type of reticular connective tissue. So as we go through this, we'll go through all of these different functions here, right? Storage, adipose tissue. Stores triglycerides, stores fat. Transport, fluid connective tissue. Your blood and your lymph, right, are going to transport material throughout the circulatory and lymphatic system there. Immune protection, we talked about that in lab, how you'll have certain immune cells in some of your tissues there. Remember the macrophages, the fixed macrophages, and the wandering macrophages. You'll have these different tissues there. All right, so you've seen this again. I won't go through this, but you've seen this figure 5.9. Learn this if you want to understand how we classify the connective tissue and which type of connective tissue falls under which category. Right? I always tell folks, go with the last two. Fluid connective tissue is easy. Blood and lymph, you're done. And then go to supporting connective tissue. Cartilage and bone, you're done. Everything else falls under connective tissue proper, if you had to guess. But we're not going to guess in here, right? We're all going to learn the material and be geniuses at it. All right, so when we're looking here at our connective tissue proper, you have two types. You've got loose and dense. And each of those types have three examples underneath them. So for our loose connective tissue, we have the three types here: areolar, adipose, and reticular. So when we learned about connective tissue, you have a couple parts to that connective tissue. Remember I said you have the cells, and then you have the stuff that's outside the cells, which we call the extracellular matrix. So you have the cells that are usually going to be making things like ground substance and the protein fibers. Well, what is the extracellular matrix? Ground substance and protein fibers, right? So in this type of connective tissue, we don't have a lot of cells or protein fibers, but guess what we got a lot of? Ground substance. Ground substance. So when you're looking at this connective tissue, the protein fibers that are existent in it, they don't have any type of pattern. They're not all laid, going from side to side. They're just arranged haphazardly. If you've ever seen like one of those paintings where someone just takes a paintbrush and just splatters paint onto the canvas, that's what this type of connective tissue looks like. It just looks like there's no organization to it, right? So our three types, the areolar, adipose, and the reticular. So these connective tissues, your body loves to use it as what we call packing material. So I'm sure that most of us have ordered something from Amazon from time to time. When you get that box, it always kills me because sometimes I'm like, why did Amazon send me this huge box with such a small item that I ordered from it? But they put a ton of packing material in there. So that's essentially what this type of connective tissue is going to be utilized for, right? To fill spaces in your body, right? To protect certain things. We'll get into some of the details here in a bit. So the first one here, this slide should look exactly like it did in lab. Okay, that's areolar connective tissue. This is your first loose type of connective tissue. So you're not going to see a lot of cells in this type of connective tissue, and you can see here. See, some of these cells aren't even touching each other. Completely different from epithelial tissue, right? What was one of the characteristics of epithelial tissue? The cells were packed, tightly packed, right? That's one of the major differences between epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Here, the cells barely touch each other, right? But in epithelial tissue, it's tightly packed. The cells are against one another here. Our protein fibers, again, we don't see a lot of them, but they're just kind of all over the place. But what we do see a lot of is ground substance here. So this type of epithelium you're going to see in, and we'll talk about it more in chapter 6 in the skin when we get there, right? You're going to see this in the upper layer of the dermis. We'll also see it if we were to dissect a cadaver and peel the skin away. Right underneath the skin, you're going to have this fatty layer. We call that the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. And so that's where you're going to see areolar connective tissue there. Lots of blood vessels in there. So we're going to see it around organs because remember, packing material. We're going to see it around your nerves and your muscles because when we get to those chapters, you're going to learn that your nerves and muscles have 3 connective tissue layers that surround, all right, these tissues there, these cells. And so one of those connective tissue layers is going to be made up of areolar connective tissue. All right. The next type of loose connective tissue is going to be the adipose connective tissue. So the most common type of cell that you're going to find in this is going to be the adipocyte. The adipocyte is what stores excess triglycerides and lipids, right, when you are in the fed states, when you're not starving. And so instead of having to use that energy for or use that fuel, using fat for fuel, we're going to store it for a rainy day. We're going to utilize it later on. All right. So these cells, when you are in a fed state, are going to be enlarged because they're full of lipids. When you are in the starved state, they will be shrunken because you're utilizing that stored energy inside of these cells. You're going to metabolize that into ATP, hopefully. So again, the predominant cell type is going to be the adipocytes. All right, and then finally we have our reticular connective tissue. This is the third type of the loose connective tissue. So this type of connective tissue you're going to see in a lot of the lymphatic or immune systems. So you're going to see lots of reticular fibers. These are those fibers that your body likes to use to make compartments, these small little spaces, like I said, like cubicles. You go into a room, it's just this huge room with a bunch of cubicles in it. And so the reticular fibers make those cubicle type of spaces in this tissue here. And then we're going to see white blood cells because we're dealing with the immune system, and then fibroblasts because, well, you need a cell to make the reticular fibers. And so they're going to make these structures, right, that create kind of like the stroma or the structural framework. So if I zoom in on this picture here, you can see, right, how these reticular fibers are making these little spaces, these little compartments here. And inside of those spaces and compartments, you're going to see your white blood cells or those leukocytes. And so again, that you'll get into more detail about that when you get into the immune chapter, but that's about as much as I want to get into. So you're going to see this in structures and tissues that are affiliated with the lymphatic system or the immune system here. So spleen, thymus, lymph nodes, bone marrow. Okay, that's where you're going to see this type of tissue. All right, the second or the other type of connective tissue proper is going to be our dense connective tissue. And so there's 3 categories for that. You have your dense regular, your dense irregular, and then your elastic. So this is dense. So you should start to think, all right, we're going to see things be a little bit more tightly packed. So we're going to see a lot less ground substance than what we saw in the loose, but we are going to see a lot more protein fibers. Okay. So less ground substance, more protein fibers in this tissue here. So, of course, when we go through the examples of this tissue, you're going to see why we're going to see mostly collagen fibers, because collagen fibers, if you recall, were the strongest type of protein fiber. Right? So collagen is going to help build strength there. So let's look at the first type, the dense regular connective tissue. And if you look there on the screen, you can see, all right, all that pink on that screen is collagen, but it's laid. You know, it's not just thrown up there like that painter that's just splattering paint on the canvas. This is laid down nice and evenly and uniformly, so there's virtually hardly any ground substance space in there. And then you'll see some fibroblasts, right, scattered throughout the matrix there, because it's the fibroblast that makes the collagen. Right, so you can see definitely the predominant structure or material in this slide picture is collagen. Hardly any ground substance, but notice you don't see any blood vessels in there. Not a bit. Right, so this type of connective tissue is going to have poor vascularity. There will be some blood vessels there, but not a lot. So when you damage this type of connective tissue, and it's found predominantly in tendons and ligaments, right, it takes a long time for this connective tissue to heal, right, depending on the extent of the damage there. All right, the next type is the dense irregular connective tissue. And now look, we've gone from having this nice uniform presentation of our collagen to now it's just these clumps, these swirling, twirling clumps. The advantage that dense irregular connective tissue has over dense regular connective tissue is that dense irregular connective tissue can handle multi-directional stretches. So you've got a pretty significant amount of dense irregular connective tissue in your skin. So you can take your skin and pull it in a bunch of different directions and it can handle that. Tendons and ligaments, they're good at handling what we call, all right, single direction stresses. So it's really hard to damage a tendon and ligament if you try to pull it apart. Very strong. But if you try to shear it or pull out on that tissue at a different angle from where it's lengthwise, you're more likely to hurt that tissue, right? So what I'm saying is, right, in tendons and ligaments, really good in a single direction, not so good in multi-directional, all right, situations like dense irregular can handle. Dense irregular connective tissue can handle it. Multi-directions. All right, so where do we find it? In the deeper layer of our skin called the dermis. And then you're going to see it, right, surrounding different organs and different structures. Remember what I told you, if you're reading something in the literature and it says something about a capsule being around, like the kidney, for example, right, that capsule is most often going to be made up of dense irregular connective tissue. There's a capsule around your adrenal gland. Same type of thing. It's going to be made up of that dense irregular connective tissue. So when you see capsules, that's what you should be thinking of, is dense irregular connective tissue, which is good. Because if anything attaches onto that capsule, it can pull on that capsule in multiple different directions, and that tissue is going to be able to handle that, which is a good sign, especially when we're dealing with periosteum. That's that outer layer that covers your bone. And then the perichondrium, which is that outer layer of connective tissue that covers your cartilage. Because what attaches onto your bones? Well, ligaments that attach bone to bone, but also tendons, which attach muscle to bone. And so those are going to have, all right, directional forces that we want to have this strong type of tissue here to handle that. All right. Then our last type of dense connective tissue is the elastic connective tissue. All right. So our elastic connective tissue, like it says, elastic. So you should be thinking, all right, this is the type of connective tissue that can stretch and then recoil and rebound. So predominantly, we're going to see tons of elastic fibers in this connective tissue. It's the elastic tissue, or those protein fibers that allow this type of tissue to stretch and relax there. So we're going to find this in large arteries like your aorta, which is kind of important because if your heart decides to start pumping more blood with more contractile force, right, the aorta needs to be able to stretch a little bit when that heart's beating a little bit harder and pushing a little bit more blood out. Because if it doesn't, we don't want it to wind up like a water balloon and popping. Right? And that's bad news because then you're instantly dead. Right? So elastic tissue is going to be in abundance in these large arteries here. Also in the trachea and the vocal cords there. Vocal cords, especially when you're talking, as I'm doing right now, they need to be able to stretch and recoil as I'm changing the opening to what we call the glottis, and that's the opening to your in the trachea that the air flows down into your lungs there. But that's over near the larynx. You'll learn about that in another class. All right. That's it for the first type of connective tissue. So that's it for connective tissue proper, which is our first type. Now we're going to move on to the second type, which is the supporting connective tissue. And then we'll do the fluid connective tissue. So the supporting connective tissue, two types, cartilage and bone. Cartilage and bone. Both are similar in which they're a little bit more solid, except that cartilage is going to be a little bit more flexible, right? So it's considered to be more of a semi-solid, but still it's going to be much more solid than the liquid or the fluid connective tissue there, obviously. So in this type of connective tissue, you're going to see a lot of protein fibers, predominantly collagen to give that tissue strength, and then elastic protein fibers to give it that flexibility. Okay, so we're going to have flexibility and strength in our cartilage. So the cell that is going to make these protein fibers and the ground substance is going to be the chondrocyte. That's the cell that makes all this stuff. And it lives in a space called the lacuna. So this should be a little bit of a review for you here. So you have the space that's in the cartilage where the cell, the chondrocyte, lives. And that chondrocyte makes this material, the collagen and the elastic fibers here. And so our cartilage is going to produce a covering that goes around the cartilage, and that's called the perichondrium. Right, and so that perichondrium, I just mentioned on the previous slide, is going to be made up of that dense irregular connective tissue. So perichondrium has two layers to it. The outer layer is called the fibrous layer, and that is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. And then the inner layer, we call that the cellular layer, and that's going to be made up of cells similar to the chondrocytes. And eventually, they'll become chondrocytes. But we'll talk about what that is in chapter 7 when we get to the bone and cartilage there. So when we deal with cartilage, right, keep in mind, and I mentioned this before, it's more flexible than bone, right? And I already said this, that mature cartilage is avascular. So just like the name of this category of connective tissue says, it's supporting connective tissue, which means it's got to be pretty strong because it's going to support a lot of your other tissues here. And we'll see why as we move through these examples here. So you have three types, right? You've got hyaline cartilage, then you have fibrocartilage, and then you have the elastic cartilage. Those are our three types. All right, so hyaline cartilage, this is the most common type of cartilage. It does, because remember I said one of the three types does not have perichondrium. This one does. And you can see all of the locations. I won't really go through this, but I mentioned it before. Nose, trachea, larynx, costal cartilage, right? Where your ribs and the cartilage come together, that's considered a joint. And so the costal cartilage is going to attach your ribs onto your sternum there. Then you have the articular cartilage that's on the ends of the long bones there. And then finally, when we discuss in more detail about the skeleton and how it forms, when you're first taking on that humanoid shape, you start to get upper and lower extremity formation going on, right? You will first develop a fetal cartilage skeleton, and then that fetal cartilage skeleton will start to transition into bone, right? And that will happen, well, I don't want to jump ahead. We'll learn about that. All right, the next type of cartilage is the fibrocartilage. This is that cartilage that undergoes a lot of compressive forces. And so this has got to be really tough cartilage, right? But unfortunately, fibrocartilage does not have a perichondrium. It does not. Right? But we're going to see lots and lots of collagen in this, and we will see some elastic cartilage in here, but we will hardly see any ground substance, very little ground substance. So we're going to see this type of cartilage in your spine and the intervertebral discs. Those are those cartilage structures in between the vertebrae, which are the bones that make up your spine. We'll also see it in your knees, called the menisci. And then finally in the pubic symphysis, which is that joint in between where your two hip bones come together in the front, right below your belly button, below your umbilicus there. So those are the three places that we're going to see fibrocartilage, but just know it doesn't have perichondrium. And then our last type of cartilage is the elastic cartilage here. Right, so again, the name of it is pretty much going to kind of give you a clue as to the predominant protein fiber that's involved in this type of tissue. And so it's going to be the elastic protein fibers, which makes the tissue that they're a part of more flexible, more springy. And so what we will notice, though, in this type of cartilage, the chondrocytes are going to be tightly packed towards one another. And so this one does have a perichondrium. And so those chondrocytes live in lacuna, because that's where chondrocytes live. They live in the lacuna. And so you're going to see this type of tissue is going to be in the pinna, right, or your auricle of your ear, and then your epiglottis, right? That's that flap that covers over the opening to your trachea. So when you're swallowing fluid or when you're eating something and you're swallowing that material will push that epiglottis over the glottis, the opening there to your trachea, so no fluid or food goes down into your lungs. And it goes into the esophagus only. All right, that's elastic cartilage. Moving on to the next type of connective tissue for supporting connective tissue is the bone. So we had cartilage, first type, bone is the second type. And there's two types of bone. You have compact, and then you have trabecular or spongy bone. Now we know that bone is going to be a little bit more sturdy and stiff compared to our cartilage, so it's going to be more rigid. So it has less elastic fibers, predominantly just collagen there. And so this is what we talked about this in lab. There's two parts to bone. You have organic and inorganic components there. And so for right now, just want you to learn our extracellular matrix, which is collagen, the protein fibers, and the glycoproteins, which is the ground substance. That's going to make up the organic component. The inorganic component, what we call bone salts, or what we have written up here called calcium salts, that's the part that makes bone hard. We'll talk about that whole process soon, but when what you do is you have these cells here called the osteocytes, and these cells are going to generate and create the organic component. And we call that osteoid. And so it makes the osteoid, which is essentially just the collagen and those glycoproteins. And then what will happen is calcium and phosphate and some other components that are the inorganic components will come along and just deposit itself into the organic component there. Think of it like a quick drying cement. So these cells are making like this quick drying cement, and then calcium and phosphate and all the others come along and just go into that quick drying cement. And as soon as they do, it starts to harden the bone matrix there. We'll learn that process later on. But those osteocytes, when they're not producing osteoid, they live inside the lacuna here. And those are those bone spaces or chambers there. All right, so we have our two types, compact bone and spongy bone. So our compact bone, this is the one that we learned in lab that has the osteons, those ring-like structures. And at the center of that ring-like structure was this space called the central canal. And that's where we have our blood vessels and our nerves. And then you have these rings that just go around that central canal there. And so those rings are what we call lamellae. And so in those ring-like structures, we're going to have our lacuna. And that's where the osteocytes live. And I'll show you a picture here in a second. Then our other type of cell is the spongy bone. And like it says, spongy bone here, right? And we call it that because of its appearance. It looks like a sponge, and it's more lightweight than compact bone because you have these areas where there's openings, literally like if you're looking close at a sponge, right, you'll see that there's holes in it. And that's what we'll see here with our spongy bone. I'll show you a picture here in a second. So when we're looking at connective tissue for bone, the functions, and you know a couple of these up here, right? We know this one here protects vital organs. We know what our bones do in our rib cage and our skull and our spine, right? The skull protects the brain. The spine protects the spinal cord, all right? So it protects these vital organs, but also they're levers for movement because your bones have skeletal muscles that attach to them. And so when those skeletal muscles contract, they'll start to move the bones. And so they act as a lever here. Supporting tissues, yeah, certain tissues, right, that will attach onto your bone, right, to help keep it from flopping around inside of your body, right? Muscles attach to your bone, right? So again, the bones make a great support site for other tissues to attach onto. And this is the one that really gets underappreciated by a lot of folks when they think about bones, and that's that it stores minerals. So it's a storage site. So when we learn about what makes bones and what molecules make up the majority of your bone structure, it is going to be calcium, phosphate, magnesium. So these will actually act as a storage site. So when your body, for example, you get low on calcium, your blood levels of calcium start to diminish, right, then your body will start to release calcium from your bones. And we'll talk about that. And really, most importantly, is going to be, all right, in our bones, you have red bone marrow. And red bone marrow is going to be the tissue that makes what we call the formed elements to your blood. The formed elements are red blood cells, erythrocytes, white blood cells, which are leukocytes, and then our thrombocytes, which are your platelets. So essentially, all of that stuff gets made in your bone marrow. And so another important reason, all right, for learning the functions here of our bone. So this picture here, you can see, right, and when we get into chapter 7, we'll get into much more detail about all of this. Here you can see our compact bone. There's our osteon, this circular structure here. And at the center, you have a space. That's the central canal, and that's where your blood vessels and where your nerves are going to be located. And then you can see you have these layers or these rings that expand around the central canal, and that you'll see in those layers, those are the lamellae, you'll see these dark spaces, and those are the lacuna. And that's where the osteocytes live, inside the lacuna. All right. Our last type of connective tissue, which is going to be our fluid connective tissue. And there's two types. I know I've mentioned this before, but I'll repeat myself. You're going to go into much more detail on this when you get into 211. I'm just going to give you some of the basics here. All right, so blood and lymph are going to be the two examples of that connective tissue. So I just mentioned to you that your red bone marrow makes the formed elements of your blood. So the red bone marrow makes those formed elements, and then it dumps those formed elements into your blood vessels. And so the red blood cells carry the respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So literally, red blood cells are going to carry oxygen from your lungs to your tissues. It's just a delivery mechanism, like a train, right, that carries cars or cattle or whatever supplies, right, from point A to point B. That's what your erythrocytes are going to do. They're going to carry oxygen from your lungs to your tissues, and then it offloads the oxygen into your tissues because you need oxygen to make a lot of ATP. You can still make ATP without oxygen, right? ATP is that awesome molecule that your cells use to make energy, right? And so if you have oxygen, you're going to make a lot of it. If you don't have oxygen, you're not going to make a lot of it. You'll still make some, right? So then when the cells are doing whatever they do, they're going to create a waste product. And when we're talking about gases, that's going to be carbon dioxide. So the red blood cells take the carbon dioxide from your tissues, bring it right up to the lungs. So when you exhale, you breathe out that carbon dioxide. So transportation for red blood cells for respiratory gases. Leukocytes, this is that protection function. And so there's a bunch of white blood cells in your blood, but there's way more in your tissues. But again, what is their job? Their job is to fight against pathogens or infectious agents, viruses, bacteria, parasitic worms, right? All sorts of things that could do us harm. And then the last component is going to be the thrombocytes, the platelets. Right? Their job is for blood clotting. So those formed elements, all right, live inside of a liquid medium, which is your blood plasma. That's the liquidy portion of your blood. Predominantly, water makes up most of that, but there's other stuff in your blood plasma that have dissolved into that water. You're going to get hormones, you're going to get ions, you're going to get electrolytes, you're going to have a whole bunch of different types of proteins, but you get to experience learning what all that is later on. So that's what we're looking here at our plasma. That's the ground substance for your blood. Now, lymph is very similar to your blood, okay, except it's missing a couple things. It doesn't have the formed elements in there. It might have some, I take that back. It's not going to have red blood cells in there. It shouldn't. All right. And it's probably going to have some white blood cells, some leukocytes, but it essentially comes from your blood plasma. You'll learn where lymph comes from again when you get into 211, right? But we will not see, right, those cellular components. Now, I know I did say that there's a possibility you'll see some white blood cells, and you will. Lymphatic fluid will contain white blood cells because your white blood cells live in your lymph nodes, for example, and lymphatic fluid flows through there. So you might see some white blood cells in that, right? But again, lymph is going to be essentially the fluid that gets drained off your tissues, goes into the lymphatic system, and then moves through the lymphatic system and eventually gets dumped back into your bloodstream. So we will ultimately return, right, the lymph back into your bloodstream. So this picture here, we saw this before. Here's a nice picture of a blood smear. You can see the predominant cell type here in our blood connective tissue is going to be the red blood cell, the erythrocyte. And then we'll have some white blood cells. And again, you should have some platelets in here. You can't see it the best. There's a little platelet cell fragment right there. I don't have a slide for lymph. All right. Questions about anything? This next, I had to get that stuff out of the way. Muscles and nervous tissue is a little bit easier. Go ahead. Oh yeah, all that stuff. Oh yeah, that'll be on there. Yep. Okay, so let's get into one of the easier types of tissues, and that's muscle. So we just did the first two tissues. Remember, we have two more to go, muscle and nervous tissue. So muscle tissue, again, when you think muscle, you should be thinking movement. Muscle M, movement M. All right, so when this tissue is stimulated, usually through nervous system interaction, it will stimulate this tissue to contract. And when it does, it creates some sort of movement. Our skeletal muscles like to move our bones. Our cardiac muscle likes to move blood through the circulatory system. And our smooth muscle likes to move things depending on where it's located. If it's located in your cardiovascular system and your blood vessels, it helps to move blood through your circulatory system. If it's located in the walls of your intestine, it helps to move digested contents through your digestive tract. So think movement when we're talking about our muscle tissue. And when we're dealing with muscle tissue, we have three types, but you only have two types of stimulation for that movement. You have voluntary and involuntary. So the only tissue listed up here that's voluntary is skeletal. That's the only one that you can control. Cardiac and smooth is involuntary. You cannot control that. Something else will control that for you, okay, which is good. I don't want to be bothered with that. I got enough things on my mind. I need to be focusing on other things. I can't be telling my heart to beat If I could control my heart rate, I think I'd make it 30 beats a minute. Nice and slow. Easy pace. You know, there's folks, and again, I don't know if anyone's ever heard this, that you only have so many heartbeats in a lifespan. Has anyone ever heard that before? There's a certain number. Yeah, I have no idea what that is, but I've heard that before. What'd you say? It is a scary thought. I'll give you an even scarier one because I'm the only male in this class. At age 50, an average male lifespan, I believe, is either 72 or 76 years here in the United States. At age 50, your average male in the United States has lived 66% of their life. That's scary. That's scary, right? I don't know the stats for ladies, but a patient told me that the other day and I did the math. I was like, oh my gosh. Yeah, I know. Anyways, let's talk about something much nicer than that. Let's talk about skeletal muscle. Okay, skeletal muscle is voluntary, so you can control it using your somatic nervous system, right? And we'll break down the different divisions and the different parts of the nervous system, all right? But the somatic nervous system, right, is the nervous system that we can use to voluntarily control, all right, some of our tissues here. So when we look at skeletal muscle, it's striated. It has a striped appearance. And we'll see that with cardiac muscle tissue too. So when you're looking under that tissue under a light microscope, it gives it a striated appearance, and that's because of the way that the proteins in the muscle tissue are positioned. When we get to chapter 10, we'll talk more about that. These cells are long cylinders, and they can run the entire length of a muscle, which is impressive to me because this is the one I was telling you about, right? That in some individuals, the longest muscle in your body is called the gracilis. No, I take that back. It's called the sartorius, and the sartorius muscle can be anywhere from 2 feet in length and even longer than that, depending on how tall the individual is. So that's a long cell, okay? But neurons can be longer than that too. All right, so some of the things that you want to know about skeletal muscle cells. One is they're multinucleated. So they're going to have several nuclei. They'll have the striations, and they are voluntary. And they are voluntary because the somatic nervous system controls them. Right now, I just memorized that fact. When we get into the nervous system, we'll expand upon that, so you'll have a better understanding. Okay, so that's skeletal muscle. All right, let's move on to the next type. Well, let's take a nice peek here. Here's our skeletal muscle. Long, cylindrical, striated, multinucleated tissue. Where do we find this tissue? Skeletal muscle all throughout the body. All right, the next type is going to be cardiac muscle tissue. Only one place that we are going to find cardiac muscle tissue, and that is going to be in the myocardium, which is the wall of your heart. It's got one job: contract the heart. And when you do that, you are going to pump blood out of the heart. That's essentially what its job is. Contraction, moving blood. Similar to skeletal muscle, it too has striations. Similar to skeletal muscle, it can have more than one nuclei. It's either going to have 1 or 2. But one of the differences that cardiac muscle tissue has that skeletal muscle doesn't have is that it bifurcates or it branches. Skeletal muscle does not. Another difference is skeletal muscle is voluntary. Skeletal muscle is involuntary. We cannot control it. Okay? And so you have cells in your heart wall called pacemaker cells that help to cause contractions for the heart, and then it causes the cardiac muscle cells to depolarize. Anyways, point being is your heart can still beat, all right, without nerves telling it to beat. So literally, you can pull the heart out of the body and it would still beat until it ran out of energy. Okay? And then you'll notice in our cardiac muscle cells, you have these structures here called the intercalated discs. And the intercalated discs help for communication between cells. It allows ions to flow from one cell directly into the next cell. So the electrical signal that moves through these cells, telling it to contract, can travel faster. And then these cells are attached to each other, right, in a better way through what we call desmosomes. Think of them as attachment points that make the connections between the cells stronger. So when the cells contract, right, the force of contraction is much more effective, getting a better rate of contraction, getting a much more efficient contraction. And here you can see cardiac muscle tissue here. You can see that we have a couple nuclei in one cell. You have some striations there, and then you can see the intercalated discs, these dark lines there within the cell there. All right, the last type of muscle tissue is going to be smooth muscle. All right, so smooth muscle, like it says, it's smooth in appearance, does not have any striations. So it's a different configuration when we talk about protein alignments inside of it. All right, smooth muscle is also involuntary. So you have no voluntary control over smooth muscle. And this is the one that has one nucleus. Okay, one nucleus, not one or two or multinucleated, just one per muscle cell. So we're going to see this type of tissue all over the place. You're going to see it in areas of your skin. You're going to see it in the walls of a lot of organs, like in your stomach, in your the walls of your blood vessels, in the walls of the urinary system, and in the digestive system here, because they're going to be moving things, all right, through those systems there. Okay, but keep in mind, this is another involuntary, all right, muscle tissue. All right, questions, thoughts, concerns? It's a lot, I know. All right, so here you can see, here's our smooth muscle cell. It's got what we call that tapered appearance. The ends of the cell are more tapered. The center of the cell is more expanded with the nucleus right in the middle there. But you won't see any striations, right? Because that's one of the differences between cardiac and smooth muscles, that cardiac has striations and smooth muscle does not. All right, last tissue type. Good news is I'm going to finish with this tissue. Bad news is I won't be able to finish the chapter, all right, on tissues. I'm going to send you a video, right? But I promise you, it's a short one, okay? It might take 10, 15, 20 minutes, all right? All right, but definitely watch it before you take the test. All right, so nervous tissue. The three places, I mentioned this, you should definitely commit this to memory because you will see this again. Where do we find it? It's brain, spinal cord, and in nerves. The first two locations make up the central nervous system. Nerves are found in what we call the peripheral nervous system. And we'll expand on that when we hit those chapters about what that means. So there's two types of cells in our nervous system, in our nervous tissue. You got the neurons, and so those are the long cells. They're the main star of the nervous system. They transmit, they receive, and they will process what we call action potentials or nerve signals. So they're the only ones that can do all that. The other type of cell in this tissue is called the glial cell. Smaller, not as long, more numerous, right? But they do not conduct, transmit, receive, or interpret any type of nerve signal. Their job is simply to protect neurons, to support neurons, right? Their job is to essentially make sure that the neurons are doing well, are healthy and happy. All right. A couple parts of the neuron. I don't think I go into, yeah, good. I don't go into too much detail here. I don't want to draw it. I'll show you here on this. So I'll come back to that cell or that picture here in a second. Let me just pull up the parts of the neuron here. All right, so you have here this end of the cell here that's got this big kind of expansion area there. That is the soma. That is the cell body. That's where you're going to have the nucleus and the organelles. And then coming off of the cell body or the soma, you have these processes coming off. These are usually shorter processes. Some will branch, some won't, right? That's not important. But you have all these processes come off, and those are called dendrites. Dendrites receive nerve information. Okay, they don't transmit, they receive that nerve information. Then you'll see one big process that comes off the cell body. It's this long tube-like structure. It's usually the largest process, and we call that the axon. So these dendrites receive that nerve information, and it all gets funneled down here to the axon, and then the axon will transmit that nerve information to the far end of the cell, right? And that's called the terminal segment down here. And at the end, you'll notice you have these structures that have these little kind of nubs or bulbs at the end, and those are called the synaptic end knobs or synaptic knobs. And so they store what we call neurotransmitter inside. And what will happen is that nerve impulse can trigger the release of that neurotransmitter, and that neurotransmitter gets released from the cell, and it either goes to another neuron or onto what we call an effector. Do y'all remember what an effector is? Remember we had the receptor control center and effector? And there's two things that can be an effector. If you don't know it, you got to know it. What are the two things that can be an effector? I heard it. Muscles and glands. Muscles and glands. So know that. An effector can be muscle or gland. And so we just learned the three different types of muscles. So it could be cardiac muscle, it could be skeletal muscle, it could be smooth muscle. In glands, we just talked about glands. Okay, we learned about sweat glands. We learned about endocrine glands, all right? Like thyroid gland, we can make thyroid hormone, all right? So keep that in mind. Effectors are muscles and glands. We'll get into more of the definite terms there, or what an effector will be specifically, which specific muscles and glands as we go through this course and in 211. All right, so let's pedal back to this slide here. So here we saw the cell body. Okay, that's where the nucleus and all those organelles, like the endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes and all that fun stuff. Then you have those processes coming off of the cell body, which are the dendrites, and they receive information coming in. And then the one big process, the one big long process that comes off the cell body, that's the axon here. And so the axon here is going to transmit that action potential, that nerve signal from the cell body to the far end, and that's where we're going to see where those synaptic knobs are. We'll learn about all this stuff. I just want to give you just a little bit of an introduction here to our neuron here. And you can see here in our slide, you have these big, huge neurons here with a bunch of these processes coming off, and then you can see these dark little dots there, and those are the glial cells. So a lot more glial cells than there are neurons. They got a big role to fill, so we need more glial cells to help out these neurons here. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I will have you